gaze into the campfire's flames, for now I shall tell you a tale of a man whose name is carved into the hulls of long ships and etched into the hearts of his enemies. Draw closer, let the mead flow freely, and may Odin's ravens bear witness to this saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, son of storm and war. Born under the watchful eyes of the gods, Ragnar came into the world surrounded by omens. Some claimed he was the son of Sigurd Hring, the great king of Sweden, and his gaze was as sharp as whetted steel. Others whispered that the blood of Odin himself flowed in his veins, for his hunger for conquest was superhuman. From his youth, destiny called to him, and he answered that call with a laugh full of scorn for death. He grew up among warriors, mastering sword and axe before words. His spirit blazed like the dawn sky, and his mind was as sharp as a breaking wave. Even in his youth, Ragnar displayed his cunning and strength, challenging a tyrannical jarl who plundered his people. But he triumphed not by blade alone, for he understood that battle was fought with both iron and wit. With a handful of warriors, he lured the enemy army into a narrow gorge where shields became walls and spears danced like vipers. The Jarl fell, and Ragnar claimed his first, but far from last, title. A true warrior is never content with a single victory. His heart yearned for unknown seas and battles worthy of sagas. Armed with an indomitable spirit, he set forth for the kingdom of the Franks, where he eventually set foot upon the proud walls of Paris. He was not yet a king, but kings already spoke his name with trepidation. On long ships, swift as the winds, with warriors hungry for glory, he laid waste to cities and strongholds, proving that there was no escape from the fury of the Northmen. For his deeds, he earned the byname Lothbrok, for in one battle he fought a gigantic serpent, clad only in thick leather breeches to protect himself from its venom. It is said the beast fell to his axe, and the gods smiled upon his courage. Since then, none dared challenge Ragnar without feeling a chilling dread at the mere mention of his name. But true glory lies not only in the might of arms, and Ragnar understood this. Through his charisma and bravery, he gathered around him the fiercest warriors and most loyal allies. Battle after battle, land after land, his fame grew like a storm on the open sea. The king of Denmark, old and weakened, saw a threat in Ragnar and sought to crush him before he grew too strong. But Ragnar was not a man to be subdued. With Thor's thunder in his heart and the fury of the winds in his sails, Ragnar marched against the Danish king. The battle was fierce. Spears splintered, and the battlefield turned into a sea of shattered shields. When the sun dipped below the horizon, Ragnar drew his sword, and the crown of Denmark fell at his feet. He had won the throne not only by force, but because the Danish warriors themselves saw in him their true leader, a man who not only commanded but lived and died for his people. Thus, Ragnar Lothbrok became king not by birthright, but by the strength of his deeds. But my friends, do you think the saga ends here? No, the legend of Ragnar was just beginning, and the gods had many more trials prepared for the son of war. The icy northern wind, like invisible blades, cut through the tangled hair of the warriors gathered in the great hall of dark wood. In the center, a fire crackled, casting strange shadows on the walls adorned with shields and trophies. Ragnar Lothbrok, a wolf among men, sat on a rough-hewn throne in his stronghold, his gaze fixed on a hand-drawn map spread before him. His calloused fingers traced the outlines of Sweden, a fertile land, rich in furs, gold, and plunder. But he desired more than just glory or wealth from this land. Something greater was at stake, something few could comprehend. Along the fjords, like whispering ghosts, rumors spread. It was said that the Swedish kings, torn by internal strife, were vulnerable. This was a rare opportunity for a cunning leader like Ragnar, who saw beyond brute force and knew that a well-planned war was won before the first blade was drawn. He did not merely wish to raid, as many had before him. He sought to build something lasting, a legacy that would echo across the farthest reaches of the known world. However, the conquest of Sweden would not be easy. Alliances had to be forged, the gods consulted, and battles fought both on land and in the hearts of his own warriors. As the mead was poured and the skald sang of deeds long past, Ragnar rose to his feet. Silence fell over the hall. His men waited with anticipation, knowing their leader never spoke without purpose. With a predatory smile, he raised his voice, which echoed like thunder above the heads of those present. The time has come to test our steel against the kings of Sweden. Many have tried, few have returned to tell the tale. Will we be remembered as conquerors or forgotten like dust on the wind? In response, a roar of warriors shook the rafters of the hall. Fate was sealed, and the campaign into Sweden was about to begin. But what awaited them? What trials and triumphs were destined for Ragnar and his warriors? You will find the answers to these questions by listening to the end of this story. Ragnar Lothbrok, King of Denmark, understood better than anyone that the crown of power, forged in iron and stained with blood, brought no peace. Enemies lurked in the shadows, like predatory wolves, and the gods tested his strength with trials worthy only of the greatest. Soon, among the Jarls, those mighty lords of lands and armies, treasonous whispers began to spread. Ragnar, undeniably a legendary warrior, but can he truly rule? Does he possess the gift of maintaining the kingdom's prosperity with more than just the might of his axe? Some doubted his abilities, daring to challenge him. The first blow came from the north, from a warlord named Hyen, who had gathered an army of traitors and landed on Danish shores with the audacious intent to wrest the crown from Ragnar's head. But the king was not one to sit idle in his halls. Without waiting for Hyen to deploy his forces, Ragnar launched a crushing strike. He did not blindly charge, but showed cunning, dividing his army and forcing the enemy to fight on treacherous terrain. The invaders were caught off guard on the hillsides, where mud hindered movement and shields proved useless. It was here that Ragnar proved he was not merely a hero of sagas, but a visionary leader who understood that a mind could be sharper than any blade. Amidst the whistling of arrows piercing the sky and war cries echoing like thunder, Hyen fell, and his head was sent back north as an ominous warning to all who dared defy the king. But a ruler's trials are not limited to battles with men. Ragnar had to confront nature itself to protect his kingdom. A merciless winter descended upon Denmark, fields withered, turning to dust scattered by the wind. Famine ravaged the people, and it seemed the wrath of the gods weighed heavily upon the king's lands, but Ragnar was not one to kneel before fate. Gathering his council, he made a daring decision to raid the Saxon kingdoms to the south, where barns overflowed with grain and Christian kings slept carelessly in their stone fortresses. And so the longships, like hungry serpents, surged into the sea, driven by the fury of hunger and necessity. Ragnar and his warriors invaded Northumbria, seizing defenseless towns and monasteries filled with gold. But one should not think Ragnar was merely a ruthless killer. He knew when the sword must give way to gold. After devastating villages and demonstrating his power, he negotiated a tribute with the Saxon lords, securing provisions for his people without unleashing a protracted war. The ships returned to Denmark, laden with grain, salted meat, and untold riches, and winter was conquered not by the grace of the gods, but by the king's bravery and cunning. But trials never end for those who bear the burden of power. Betrayal crept into the highest halls, and Ragnar understood that not all his servants were loyal to the end. Among the Jarls were those who schemed in secret, awaiting the opportune moment to strike him from behind. The most dangerous of them was Harald Grey Wolf, a formidable warrior whose heart was cold as ice and filled with ambitious designs. He spread lies, claiming Ragnar was weakened, that he preferred negotiations to battles, and that the gods had turned their backs on him. And so Harald gathered his army and marched against the king, hoping that doubts had undermined his leadership. But Ragnar was well versed in the games of war and power. He did not wait for the storm to break upon him. He struck first. Dividing his army into 3 parts, he used Harald's arrogance against him. When the forces of the traitors attacked what seemed to be a small detachment of Ragnar's army, they fell into a carefully laid trap. Shields closed around them like a wolf's jaws, and in a furious battle under pouring rain, Harald was slain by the king himself. The traitor's head was raised high before the Jarls, and Ragnar proclaimed, "Let this be the fate of all who mistake mercy for weakness." Having crushed his enemies and solidified his rule, Ragnar set his gaze beyond the horizon. Denmark was safe, but his people craved more. Sagas are not sung of those content with what they have. The sea called, and new kingdoms awaited their conquerors. Ragnar knew that his destiny was still being woven by the gods. When Denmark finally found stability under his rule, Ragnar felt that even vast and mighty kingdoms could not satisfy his ambitions. The throne of Denmark, which he had conquered with such effort, seemed too confined for the grandeur of his plans. Ragnar, the Viking king, no longer saw himself as merely the ruler of one people, but as a sovereign worthy of more lands, more riches, and, above all, more power. It was then, on a quiet winter's day, while poring over maps and listening to the winds blowing from the north, that Ragnar made a decision that would forever change the course of his reign, to expand his dominion by conquering Sweden. The neighboring kingdom, with its boundless forests and mountains, was rich in natural resources, especially iron, timber, and precious minerals. The Swedish tribes, numerous but fragmented, were constantly warring among themselves. For Ragnar, this was a unique opportunity to unite these tribes under his rule and create an even more powerful Norse empire. Ragnar began the conquest of new lands with a series of strategically calculated strikes against smaller Swedish kingdoms on the southern borders. He did not immediately aim to storm powerful centers of resistance. Instead, he chose a tactic of lightning raids on coastal settlements, systematically weakening local defenses. His approach was simple, yet strikingly effective. The Vikings plundered while simultaneously sending an unmistakable signal. Anyone who dared resist their will would face harsh retribution. The Swedish warriors, despite their numbers, were accustomed to internecine wars, but Ragnar brought something different. A cohesive, well-trained army led by a commander who inspired loyalty and respect. Ragnar's fame preceded his forces, and soon many Swedish tribes began to see his arrival not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He presented himself not as a ruthless conqueror, but as a chieftain capable of bringing order and stability to the fragmented Swedish lands. After several months of raids, Ragnar decided on a bolder move. He advanced towards the southern regions, where warring clans were particularly warlike and stubbornly rejected the idea of submitting to a foreign ruler. There, King Sverker reigned, the most influential leader in Sweden at the time, known for his military might and widespread support among the northern clans. Ragnar saw Sverker as the only true obstacle to his expansion. Understanding that a direct confrontation with Sverker could lead to unacceptable losses, Ragnar chose a more subtle and strategic approach. He sent envoys to Sverker with an offer of alliance instead of open war. In exchange for loyalty, Ragnar promised support against other Swedish kingdoms that still resisted his expansion. It was a daring proposal. Ragnar understood that by bringing Sverker to his side, he would compel the Swedish king to submit to a more powerful leader, yet retain his position and control over his lands. Sverker hesitated for a long time, but Ragnar's arguments were compelling and well-reasoned. He spoke of the benefits of an alliance that would ensure prosperity for both kingdoms through trade, mutual protection, and combined military strength against common enemies. The negotiations were tense, but in the end, Sverker agreed to the alliance. Denmark and northern Sweden were now under Ragnar's rule. However, this alliance, as Ragnar well knew, could not be eternal. The Swedish tribes, accustomed to independence, were unlikely to tolerate long-term control. Ragnar understood that his victory would not be easy or final. With Sverker as an ally, Ragnar set about organizing the governance of the new territories. He appointed governors to various regions and implemented a series of reforms to ensure the integration of the conquered lands into the Danish Empire. But he knew that the main challenge would be maintaining control over the various Swedish factions, each with their own traditions and deep roots. The battle for the unification of Sweden had to unfold not only on battlefields, but also in the hearts and minds of its people. Ragnar did not suspect that the seeds of discord had already been sown. The alliance with Sverker, however advantageous it might be, stirred envy and ambition among other Swedish leaders. While Ragnar consolidated his power in the south, some tribes began to question the legitimacy of his rule, and the threat of war once again loomed over the northern lands. Ragnar Lothbrok, now ruler of Denmark, began to consolidate his position in Sweden. Despite significant successes in the 3 years since his arrival, he understood that the path to complete victory would be long and arduous. The conquered territory was full of challenges, and Swedish resistance did not wane. He captured villages, took fortresses, and imposed his authority on most of the southern tribes. But new trials awaited him, demanding vigilance and strategic thinking. Victories at first came relatively easily, but soon Ragnar felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Each triumph over Swedish foes was met with treacherous retaliation. Tribes that had submitted to his rule rose in rebellion again, striving to regain their independence. One battle served as a harsh reminder of the difficulties of his reign. Ragnar moved north into the vast region of Västergötland, where a coalition of local tribes united against him. The battle was fierce, and although Ragnar emerged victorious, he lost many of his finest warriors, which temporarily weakened his military might. But he did not retreat. Instead, he reevaluated his strategy, reorganized his troops, and conducted additional training. The Vikings under his command became even more lethal and disciplined. But no matter how outstanding a leader Ragnar was, a sense of unease never left him. The true strength of Sweden lay not only in the lands he already controlled. The most important test, the true prize, awaited him in the north, where the capital, Uppsala, a sacred city, was located, where the High King of Sweden resided. This was the final bastion, the ultimate test for Ragnar. All the victories and defeats of previous years were merely a prelude to the final confrontation, and he understood this. Among his warriors, rumors circulated that the city of Uppsala possessed ancient, perhaps even supernatural powers. Many Vikings spoke of the great sacred tree, Yggdrasil, which, according to legend, grew somewhere near the city, and that whoever mastered Uppsala would gain the favor of the gods. For Ragnar, the city was not just a strategically important objective, but a symbol of his supremacy. Taking the capital would undoubtedly mean claiming the title of High King of Sweden, a destiny he believed was his. However, as a warlord forged in the crucible of countless battles, Ragnar understood that the key to the triumphant completion of his mission lay not only in brute force, but also in strategic patience. Years of ruling in southern Sweden had given him a deep understanding of the intricacies of northern politics. He learned that trust was a valuable resource, especially in relations with fragmented tribes and factions. Therefore, Ragnar had to act with prudence, forging tactical alliances and neutralizing those who saw him as a threat. Equally important was maintaining the loyalty of his own army, as the success of any undertaking, as is known, depends on the morale of the warriors. At the end of each day spent in battle, he closely observed his warriors, trying to discern the slightest signs of weariness or doubt. This caused him concern. As a leader, he understood that he had no right to waver. His realm, his dynasty, stood on the threshold of great achievements. However, Uppsala, with all its grandeur and mystery, remained an unresolved task. Despite his power extending over a significant part of Sweden, the High King, the last stronghold of resistance, still stood in his way. Nevertheless, Ragnar felt that the hour of reckoning was near. His army, now even more powerful and experienced, was preparing for a decisive thrust towards their destiny. But before taking this step, he needed time for thorough preparation. He had already demonstrated his strength and ambition. Now he had to show cunning. Ragnar was confident that Uppsala would fall, but he knew it would not be easy. Too much was at stake, and the battle for the capital promised to be the most challenging he had ever faced. After 3 years of continuous conquests and victories in Sweden, Ragnar Lothbrok was nearing the culmination of his reign. His army, terrorizing the entire region, advanced with relentless determination, and his name became a symbol of strength and dread. However, as he approached Shalom, the capital where Sigurd, the High King of Sweden, resided, a new threat emerged, not from an external foe, but from within Ragnar's own ranks. Betrayal came from Sverker, one of Ragnar's most trusted commanders. It seemed that with each victory, Sverker gained more power and influence, fueling his secret ambitions. Over time, he began to doubt Ragnar's leadership, believing himself a more worthy ruler. This thought was shared by others, ready to rebel against the king, but fearful of exposure. The situation reached a critical point on a dark night when Sverker, supported by several officers, raised a rebellion within Ragnar's army. The betrayal was sudden and brutal. One frosty morning, as Ragnar was in his camp, his own troops rebelled against him, striking at the weakest garrisons. By the time Ragnar learned of what had happened, it was already too late. Many of his warriors had defected to Sverker's side, and those who remained loyal were outnumbered. However, the king was not one to be broken. He had endured far greater trials and knew that victory always demanded a price in blood. With a heavy heart, yet an unyielding spirit, Ragnar called a meeting of his closest officers and marched on to the battlefield. The clash between the two former comrades in arms was inevitable. In an open field, surrounded by dark trees and a biting wind, Ragnar met Sverker in single combat, a duel that would forever be remembered by eyewitnesses. Sverker, driven by youthful fervor, believed he could overcome the great Ragnar, but he forgot the experience the king had gained in countless battles. They fought with fury, their blades clashing with deafening clangor. Ragnar, emboldened by an unwavering sense of justice, ultimately prevailed over Sverker, piercing his chest with his sword. However, the victory came at a steep price. Ragnar was wounded, his army suffered heavy losses, and the morale of his troops was shaken, but he had no intention of retreating. His gaze was fixed on the capital, where the true battle awaited him. The repercussions of the betrayal were palpable. Weeks passed after Sverker's defeat, and Ragnar found his army weakened, many warriors having returned to their villages, disheartened and exhausted. Yet the specter of the Swedish throne, the last obstacle to complete dominion, gave him no rest. Ragnar understood that if he wished to consolidate his power and become the High King of Scandinavia, the time had come to take the capital, Shalom. After several weeks of reorganization and recuperation, Ragnar gathered his forces, now more cohesive and determined, and marched on the great city with the fury of a man who had tasted the bitterness of betrayal and was not about to let it stop him. He knew that the final confrontation with Sigurd and his army would be the decisive test of his ascent. Ragnar was ready to take Shalom and become the High King of Sweden. The path to the capital would be long and arduous, but nothing could stop him. He had survived the betrayal of a close associate and emerged victorious, and now he was marching towards the final battle that would determine his destiny. Ragnar Lothbrok and his retinue, traversing countless miles, carved their way through the icy expanses of the Swedish land. The biting cold pierced them to the bone, and the sharp wind whistled fiercely through the dense forests. Despite the heavy losses suffered from the treacherous blow, Ragnar's heart blazed with an unquenchable drive towards his destined fate. He understood that triumph lay not only in taking Shalom, but in achieving the status of High King of Sweden. A significant portion of the land had already bowed to his might, but the final bastion, the decisive battle, awaited, and Ragnar had no intention of retreating. The assault on the capital began in the pre-dawn gloom when the silhouettes of Shalom's towers barely emerged on the horizon. The mighty city walls rose as an impenetrable barrier, and the Swedish warriors, led by Sigurd, prepared to fight to the death. However, Ragnar was not daunted by stone fortresses, only the specter of defeat tormented him. He knew that failure would mean the collapse of his hopes for the unification of Denmark under his scepter, and would strip his name of glory in the songs of future skalds. He was ready to do anything for victory. The first day of the siege was marked by a series of swift attacks and cunning ambushes. Ragnar, using his small retinue and innate cunning, set traps for enemy patrols, gradually weakening the city's defenses. He did not aim for immediate success. His goal was to wear down Sigurd's warriors, forcing them to retreat behind the walls, creating a sense of complete isolation for the city dwellers. For 4 days, Ragnar and his army methodically stormed the fortifications, understanding that time was against them. Food supplies dwindled and resources were scarce. Each battle became a harsh trial, a test of resilience. The siege unfolded not only outside the impregnable walls, but also in the hearts of the Vikings fighting shoulder to shoulder with Ragnar. Hardships and privations weighed upon them, eroding their morale. By the 3rd week of the siege, the battle reached its climax, intensifying to its limit. Ragnar, possessing unrivaled martial experience, led daring sorties to the city walls. His army was small, but he led it with the resolve of a man who knew his purpose. He was not just a king, but a warrior, ready to assert his right to the throne. One night, during a surprise attack, Ragnar managed to destroy one of the defensive towers, creating a breach in the wall. Sigurd, feeling the noose tightening, launched his best forces in a counterattack. But Ragnar, displaying his cunning, had prepared a daring plan. Instead of waiting for another assault, he used the cover of night and, leading a small detachment, executed a daring breakthrough through a secondary city gate. Inside the city, a fierce struggle erupted. Ragnar, sword in hand, mercilessly cut down all who dared block his path. The ground of Shalom became a mire of blood and ice, and the cries of warriors mingled with the clang of steel. Sigurd's defenders, outnumbered, gradually lost ground, and the city began to crumble under the onslaught of Ragnar's furious attacks. The fight for the city continued all day, and the seemingly endless siege reached its culmination. Ragnar, exhausted but insatiable in his thirst for victory, led his warriors in a final assault, breaching the last lines of defense. His men, worn out but united by a common purpose, let out such a mighty war cry as Shalom had never heard before. Sigurd, realizing his army could no longer withstand the enemy's onslaught, attempted to organize a final line of defense in the central square. But Ragnar, as always, was one step ahead. In the decisive confrontation, Ragnar came face to face with Sigurd, surrounded by his elite guard, ready to give their lives for their king. The final battle transformed into a deadly dance, surpassing in its fury all of Ragnar's previous engagements. He cut through flesh and bone, demonstrating to Sigurd the mastery of a true warrior. Sigurd, in turn, was no weak opponent, but Ragnar's resolve, his unyielding drive to become the High King of Sweden, proved stronger. With one precise strike, Ragnar felled Sigurd. The Swedish king collapsed to the ground, his sword falling from his weakening hand as life left his body. Ragnar, breathing heavily and bloodied, looked at the man who had dared to challenge his ascent. Silently, he approached Sigurd and, with the air of a victor, touched his sword to the chest of his fallen foe. This was not merely a military victory, but a triumph of spirit, the victory of a man who had forged his path to the pinnacle with blood, sweat, and the unyielding fire of a true leader. When the city quieted and the smoke of battle cleared, Ragnar stood in the center of Shalam, surveying the surviving inhabitants. In their gazes, there was not only admiration, but also recognition of him as a conqueror and unifier of lands under his banner. Ragnar, sword in hand and gaze fixed on the distance, understood that he was now not merely the King of Denmark, but the High King of Sweden, a man who had earned everything he achieved. Trumpets blared through the streets of the Swedish capital, and the skalds, witnesses to his triumph, began to compose songs about the Viking king who was content with nothing less than the entire world at his feet. Ragnar Lothbrok's ascent was complete. He had become the High King of Sweden. In the flickering light of the campfire, where the flames, like spirits of ancient warriors, dance in the night, the storyteller begins the narrative of Ragnar Lothbrok's glorious culmination. This legendary son of the dragon, whose iron heart made Denmark tremble, had reached the pinnacle of his greatness. After countless trials and bloody battles, Sweden, with its impenetrable forests and formidable icy mountains, had fallen at his feet. The resounding blare of trumpets echoed across the frozen lands, proclaiming his triumph. On the hills of Shalam, where the blood of the fallen mingled with the white snow, Ragnar Lothbrok looked down upon the ruins of the city, once the impregnable bastion of King Sigurd. Now, with the unwavering gaze of a warrior who had walked through fire and water, he sat upon the throne. The High King of Sweden was no longer a mere mortal, having transformed into a monstrous conqueror, a monarch who transcended the bounds of human understanding. In that hour, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Ragnar stood before his new dominion. The weight of the crown upon his head felt not like a burden, but a symbol embodying a man who had fought with all his might to fulfill his destiny. He surveyed his warriors, who had survived the siege and the merciless battles. They stood before him, exhausted and mud-stained, but with eyes full of pride. They knew that Ragnar, who had vanquished the fiercest winds and formidable foes, had become the king who would lead them to new lands and conquests. The wind pierced the city walls, and the campfire's flames danced like the souls of fallen warriors who had fought shoulder to shoulder with Ragnar until their last breath. The words of the skalds, in their eternal wisdom, echoed in the frosty night, recalling the songs of forgotten heroes who once surrounded Ragnar. Those who gave their lives for their land become kings, but immortal is he who conquered the hearts of his people and faced victory like a god. Thus, the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok was carved into the stones of Sweden, in the lands he now ruled. The High King of Denmark and Sweden, an indomitable warrior who surpassed human capabilities, became an eternal hero, sung of in the skalds' songs. As the fire fades and the shadows deepen, this story will be passed down by word of mouth, from generation to generation. For when Ragnar Lothbrok raised his axe and conquered these lands, it was not merely a conquest, but the birth of a legend, and his story will live forever as long as the last skald lives.